The West Coast of the United States has historically been a huge success story for the country. Between 1940 and 2020, the region grew by over 42 million people. But since 2020, more than 500,000 people have left these states. This is despite the entire region having a robust economy with pleasant weather, incredible scenery, and bustling cities. So why have so many people left the region? But first, let's rewind and talk about the region's incredible success story throughout history. The West Coast has always been a destination for migration. This began long before European settlers arrived. Tens of thousands of years ago, humans would first reach the coastlines of Washington, Oregon, and California and realize that it was a great place to live in. So it's not surprising that, eventually, Europeans and then Americans would come to the same conclusion. But due to the complicated geography of the western half of the United States, namely the imposing Rocky Mountain Range, it would take a while for Americans to really begin settling the region in significant numbers. The United States' acquisition of the region during the 1800s sparked the initial wave of migration. The Oregon Trail brought settlers to the Pacific Northwest with promises of fertile farmland in the Willamette Valley, driving migration to Oregon. Similarly, the California Gold Rush of 1848 to 1855 drew hundreds of thousands of people from across the globe, seeking wealth in the Sierra Nevada foothills. By 1850, California's population had surged to over 92,000 people, a dramatic increase from its pre-Gold Rush levels. The region's appeal was solidified by its temperate climate, abundant natural resources, and growing infrastructure. California's population growth continued steadily in the late 1800s and early 1900s, fueled by agriculture and industry. The Central Valley emerged as one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world, attracting workers from across the US and immigrants from countries such as Japan, China, and the Philippines. By 1900, California's population had reached 1.5 million people, while Oregon and Washington saw smaller but significant growth, with populations of approximately 414,000 and 518,000 people respectively. The West Coast's physical geography played a central role in its migration and success. California's Mediterranean climate and fertile valleys supported a booming agricultural sector, while the forests of Washington and Oregon fueled the timber industry. The rugged Cascade and Sierra Nevada mountain ranges posed challenges, but also offered opportunities for mining. And the West Coast harbors, particularly in LA, San Francisco, and Seattle, became vital trade hubs linking the United States to the Pacific Rim. Spurred by industrial growth and the rise of the entertainment industry, Los Angeles became the center of the film industry, attracting creative and technical talent. Meanwhile, the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl of the 1930s drove many Midwesterners westward, with California serving as a symbol of opportunity and escape. By 1940, the collective population of the West Coast had surged to nearly 10 million people. World War II marked another pivotal moment, as the demand for military production transformed the region. Seattle's Boeing factories and the shipyards in Portland and San Francisco drew workers from across the country, fueling population growth and urbanization. The post-war era saw the West Coast emerge as a center of technologic innovation, culminating in the rise of Silicon Valley in the latter half of the 1900s. California's population exploded to over 15 million by 1950 and continued to grow, reaching 39 million by 2020. Washington and Oregon also experienced significant growth, with populations of 7.7 million and 4.2 million, respectively, by 2020. But then, something started happening to the region. Starting in 2010, California's growth began to slow considerably. And while Oregon and Washington were still growing, they too would stall after 2020. So what's going on? Did you know that your body needs about 50 grams of protein and a wide range of vitamins and minerals every single day? I did not, which is why I'm very happy that I found Huel. Huel has become my daily routine, not only because it's convenient, but because it's helped me tackle the most important meal of the day, while also giving me everything I need to stay healthy. In every single bottle of Huel, there is 35 grams of protein and 27 essential vitamins and minerals that make this single bottle 100% nutritionally complete. This means less feeling hungry and snacky throughout the day, and more feeling great and energized. And now that I'm going to be traveling the world, finding energy in my daily meals is going to be extra important. So, If you're feeling like you don't get enough protein, vitamins, or minerals in your everyday diet, come join me. Right now, you can get 15% off Huel today with code GEOFF at Huel.com/Geoff. Fuel your best performance today with Huel. Since 2020, California, Oregon, and Washington have experienced notable demographic shifts, particularly in their major urban centers. These changes are influenced by factors such as the COVID-19 pandemic, economic considerations, and evolving lifestyle preferences. California has witnessed a population decline, with residents migrating to states like North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Tennessee, and Texas, primarily due to high living costs. In San Francisco, the initial pandemic period saw a population decrease. Los Angeles also experienced population declines during the early pandemic years, with residents moving to more affordable regions. Oregon's population growth has also decelerated post-2020, with Portland specifically experiencing population declines. One notable population shift here is that many former Portlanders simply moved across the river into Washington state, notably Vancouver, Washington, a nearby suburb of Portland. And finally, Washington has also seen a slowdown in population growth since 2020, though less so than either California or Oregon. In particular, Seattle declined in population between 2020 and 2022. Recent data does suggest the city is growing once again, but at a rate far less than it was prior to 2020. 2020 hit all three states and their respective cities hard, but 2020 hit the entire world hard. And since then, many other places have fully rebounded. The West Coast? Well, it's complicated. The West Coast of the United States has become nearly impossible to live in. California in particular has some of the highest expenses in the entire world. So extreme that even those in high-paying tech jobs can struggle to make ends meet. But this region is getting increasingly hard to live in, not just because it's expensive. While the high cost of living is one of the most visible and talked about issues facing the region, it's merely the tip of the iceberg. But let's go through it one by one. The entire west coast of the United States was built around people having access to their own personal vehicles to get around, unlike the dense rail-connected regions of the Northeast. And this means that gas prices have a huge impact on every person's ability to live. If gas prices rise, people have little recourse to alter their travel patterns because reliable and consistent public transit, bicycle routes, and even pedestrian-friendly areas are few and far between. And gas on the West Coast is already very expensive. Gas prices on the West Coast routinely exceed the national average. As of January 2025, it costs $4.35 per gallon in California, $3.90 per gallon in Washington, and $3.45 in Oregon. Compare those numbers to Texas, which is currently sitting at $2.66 per gallon, and you can see the huge difference. It would cost almost double to fill a 20-gallon tank in California compared to Texas. And while it's expensive today, the West Coast has consistently been the most expensive in the country for the last couple decades. In fact, in 2022, California recorded its highest gas price ever at $6.44. Of course, gas is just a single measure of higher costs in the region. The cost of food is also steep, driven by high labor and transportation costs, as well as regulatory measures unique to the region. Grocery bills in these states are often among the highest in the country, putting additional pressure on household budgets. According to a recent article, California topped the country in the average amount a family spends on groceries. On average, California families spend about $300 per week, well above the national average of $270. It may sound like an insignificant difference of around 10%, but 10% here, 70% more on gas, and you're starting to see the pattern. But even though those prices are high, they're not the main issue, which is much, much worse. More so than anything else, one of the primary issues facing the West Coast is the cost of housing. This is perhaps the most significant challenge for the West Coast and a primary reason why it's become almost impossible to live here. Urban centers like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Portland have become synonymous with skyrocketing real estate prices and rental costs. The median home price in San Francisco hovers around $1.5 million, while in Seattle, it exceeds $800,000. Even Portland, traditionally seen as a more affordable option, has seen its housing market surge, with median home prices approaching $550,000. These costs push many families out of cities and into surrounding suburbs or entirely different states. Renters face similar struggles, with monthly rents often exceeding $3,000 in major cities, leaving little room for savings or discretionary spending. Efforts to build affordable housing have been hindered by zoning laws, local opposition, and bureaucratic hurdles, leaving many unable to find suitable accommodations. The escalating cost of living on the West Coast has created a particularly acute crisis for public servants, such as teachers, nurses, firefighters, and other essential workers, who increasingly find themselves unable to afford housing in the cities where their presence is most critical. These professions, while indispensable to the functioning of any community, often do not offer the salaries that keep pace with the exorbitant cost of urban living. As a result, many of these workers are being driven to live in distant suburbs or entirely different regions, adding significant commuting burdens and eroding their quality of life. In cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Portland, it's not uncommon for teachers and nurses to spend over half their income on rent or mortgage payments, far above the recommended 30% threshold for housing costs. Firefighters, EMT responders, and police officers, often on call for emergencies, face the additional challenge of being hours away from the communities they serve. The inability to live locally not only impacts their personal well-being, but also undermines their ability to respond quickly in times of crisis. For many, the financial and logistical strain of such an arrangement becomes unsustainable, leading them to seek opportunities in other states with lower living costs and less housing pressure. This exodus of public servants has left many cities grappling with staffing shortages in critical sectors. Schools struggle to retain teachers, hospitals face mounting workloads for fewer nurses, and fire departments are stretched thin during wildfire season. The long-term implications are severe, as these shortages are eroding the infrastructure of cities up and down the West Coast, reducing the quality of services and worsening the challenges for the residents who remain. For public servants, the decision to leave often carries a sense of resignation. They are forced to choose between their professional commitments and the basic necessity of an affordable, stable living situation. All of this culminates in one especially challenging livability issue for the West Coast: the rise in homelessness. Since the Great Recession, all three states have seen a dramatic rise in the amount and visibility of homelessness. And starting around 2020, large homeless encampments became commonplace in all three states. As of 2024, there are over 170,000 homeless living in California, more than 25,000 in Washington state, and more than 17,000 in Oregon. And with an increase in the basic cost of living and housing, combined with essential workers who are unable to afford to live in these states, the problem becomes worse for everyone. This, in turn, drives more people to places where a consistent homeless population isn't as visible. But beyond financial challenges, natural disasters have also made the West Coast increasingly difficult to live in. Wildfires have become an annual crisis, with vast stretches of forest and countryside igniting during the dry summer months. The fires not only destroy homes and infrastructure, but also produce thick smoke that blankets entire regions, sometimes for weeks. Cities like Portland and Seattle have recorded some of the worst air quality in the world during the wildfire season, with particulate levels far exceeding safe limits. The smoke impacts respiratory health, exacerbates chronic conditions, and diminishes overall quality of life. Combined with other environmental threats such as earthquakes, droughts, and flooding, the West Coast's natural hazards present an ongoing risk to residents. Finally, the region's political landscape further complicates living here. The West Coast is often seen as a bastion of progressive politics, with state governments in California, Oregon, and Washington enacting policies that reflect this ideology. While these policies have been praised by some for addressing climate change, social justice, and public health, they have alienated others. Conservative-minded residents often feel out of place in the region's political climate, leading many to relocate to states like Idaho, Texas, and Florida, where they perceive a more welcoming ideological environment. This exodus has contributed to the broader polarization of the United States, with the West Coast becoming emblematic of progressive values, and its critics citing it as a cautionary tale of overreach. Of course, all of this was made worse during the COVID-19 pandemic. Remote work policies enabled many workers to leave expensive West Coast urban centers for more affordable areas. States like Arizona, Nevada, and Texas saw significant population growth during this period, as former West Coast residents sought lower costs of living and greater personal space. For many, the decision to leave was final. Once settled in more affordable regions, the idea of returning to the West Coast became increasingly untenable. High living expenses, combined with the challenges of re-establishing a home in a costly market, discouraged many from coming back. Now, all that said, today, all 3 states have begun to rebound. Washington State, in particular, has begun seeing a normal level of growth once again. But there's still nothing that has solved the West Coast's underlying problems. A combination of high costs of living and housing, dwindling social services, an increase in homelessness, and frequent wildfires have increasingly made living on the West Coast impossible for many. And once people leave, either for political, cultural, or affordability reasons, few ever return. This was a really challenging video for me to make because I love the West Coast. I live here in Oregon, and I want everyone to love it as much as I do. But the region has some very, very real issues facing it, and unless all 3 states are able to make some serious changes, fewer and fewer people will be able to enjoy it. I hope you enjoyed and learned something from this video. If you did, consider checking out this video on the weird US-Canada border. Thanks for watching. See you next week.